All right, it's 5 past. Well, it's loud. Welcome back to week 4 of Elements of Digital Cultures. Today our lecture is on text. Before I introduce a guest speaker, I want to make an announcement for next week. So next week lecture is on sound. We are not having physical lecture. Guess what? So next week the lecture will be delivered as a podcast. You will go to Canvas and download the podcast lecture. So we are not meeting face-to-face next week for lecture, all right? So go to Canvas, the link will be there next week, this time. So let me introduce a guest speaker for today. Dr. Chris Cheshire is a senior lecturer in the discipline of media and communications. The reason why all of you are here, because he co-founded this digital cultures program, and he also the master of digital communication culture. He holds a PhD from Macquarie University and a master's degree in interdisciplinary studies from UNSW. Dr. Chester's scholarship bridges philosophy and sociology of technology, science and technology studies, game study, internet study, human-computer interaction, social cultural robotics, and digital humanities. His latest book, Evocation of Media, Reconceptualizing the Computer, was published last year by Bloomsbury. The book actually received an honorary mention for the 2024 AOIR Nancy Ben Book Award, which is a highly prestigious award in internet studies. So without further ado, I'll pass the time to Dr. Cheshire.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so today's topic is text, but we can also kind of think of it as being about language and also about semiotics, so the science of signs. I'm going to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. For millennia, the Gadigal people have been storytellers, knowledge keepers, and communicators, passing wisdom through songlines, oral traditions, and cultural practices. As we discuss communication today, we honour the enduring ways First Nations people have shared knowledge, built relationships, and sustained communities. Their voices remind us that communication is not just about words, but about connection, responsibility, and respect. Now, will you think it's weird if I said that this was an acknowledgement of country that I got ChatGPT to create? Is that some kind of transgression about the authenticity and genuineness of my acknowledgement of country? Or is language ever simply authentic? So just a quick overview. I'm going to talk about writing and print and the transition between the concreteness of early writing technologies towards the abstraction of alphabetic text, and then to electronic text and the features of electric language. And then finally, I'll be talking about understanding understanding signs, so linguistics, semiotics, and large language models. I'll give you a brief introduction to structuralism, which you could run a whole course on, so let's see how we go with that. And then an introduction to how large language models work and the interesting parallels between those two phenomena. I've included an abstract which I wrote last night and posted on Facebook because I was kind of working through the argument. So if you have access to the PDF, that's kind of a record of the overall argument, particularly the semiotics and large language models. So text, like language often does, the concept of text is based on a metaphor of text array, of text or fabric And so text is sort of considered to be something equivalent to fabric, and it's a concrete phenomenon as opposed to, say, speech. Text operates according to sets of conventions, and it is physically connected to the surface on which it operates. But let's think about the difference between a culture and a kind of psychological condition and a social condition, between oral culture, which doesn't have sort of complex systems of writing, and that is characterized by sound. And sound surrounds us, which is different from print that I'll come to. Speech, for most people, is acquired organically, so there's not as much tuition. It's sort of intuitive as compared to written communication. It's synchronous, and it's based on relationships. So if you are listening to somebody speak, it's because there's an existing social relationship between the speaker and the receiver, and there's particular kind of conditions or protocols about who you can speak to and how you should speak to them. It's possible to kind of keep secrets. So oral culture is characterized by kind of mythical storytelling and the association of rituals to do with kind of repetition and song lines and so on. Writing, on the other hand, is based on sight. So you're distanced from it, and you do it privately. To do so, it requires formal education, and that's kind of become a very large part of the population only relatively recently. It's asynchronous, which means that you don't have to read it at the same time as it was written. And it lacks presence. That's kind of one of the questions. What is the presence of the speaker? And it allows for abstract and analytical thought. You can go back and edit your text and make analytical points about your argument. It also allows bureaucracies and all sorts of complex institutions. And it's characterized by the emergence of the text. There's a story about this, which is that written language went from concrete to more abstract forms. So cuneiform, which was one of the earliest forms of writing in Mesopotamia, is characterized by a very direct relationship between a piece of writing and the objects in the world. Hieroglyphics became more associated with religious rituals. In China, oracle bone script also had, I guess, the grounds of the pictographic or logographic style of writing. The Phoenician alphabet, so this is where you have the capacity to arrange a much smaller set of marks on the surface. And in this case, it was purely consonants. So it did relate to sound, the way the words are sounded out. And similarly, in Greece, you have alphabet with vowels. In the Middle Ages in Europe, you had scribal culture, which was religious texts that were written out by hand with kind of decorative elements. But then around 1440, Europe kind of developed movable type and the Gutenberg press. Of course, this was preceded by centuries by Chinese woodblock, but that didn't end up having exactly the same social impacts as the printing press. So the printing press allowed for mass production. So that means you could have not just one copy of a text, but hundreds or even thousands of copies based on the mechanical reproduction. And you had various kind of cultural forms associated with print media, so books, pamphlets, newspapers, and the conventions about how those work, with novels, political pamphlets, daily newspapers associated with the city, and so on. And one of the characteristics of it was the uniformity of the text and the standardization. You had typography, which is the characters, orthography, which is punctuation and so on, spelling. So you had a range and also grammar. So these were associated with particular vocations, particular kind of specialists in creating text, editing, sub-editing. It brought the invention of the author, and it developed a language of typefaces. So you can see that people who design type have their own language, and they categorize typefaces according to whether they have serifs, the serifs are these little bits at the end of the text. And so those are ways in which the visible gets structured by a typeface. And a typeface has meaning, but according to a kind of visual code, which is different from the alphabetic way that language is constructed as characters. So you could say that these characters are all the same, but of course visually they're different from one another. So what happens when text went electronic? The kind of most famous technology in the 19th century in this form was the telegraph, which operated through Morse code. And so Morse code is like dit, 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 dat, dit, dat, dit. Well, no, I'm not doing it very well. And so it was a kind of translation of writing into sound, and each of the characters in the alphabet were manifest in a particular sequence of dots and dashes. That got supplemented by automatic printing telegraphs, and later on, another form of writing was the key punch and the punch card, which is a way of communicating information through holes in a piece of card that was originally used for textiles, for working the way that a loom would create patterns in the fabric. And then it became a device for digital computing. So Morse code is something that the operator has to remember, but when you have digital text, ultimately before you can have any characters, you need to have a standard about what those characters will be, the numerical values that are associated with a character. So you can see here that the binary values, so the reason you have binary values like that is because if you had to print out every character, it would be a huge amount of storage. But if you agree that this is the decimal value of the letter A in ASCII, American Standard Code for Information Interchange, and this is the binary value that the computer actually works with. And you can see that here the binary values, so that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, and so on. And there's a difference between the capitals with this bit, and the lowercase with this bit, and the capitals with this bit. So there's a kind of logic behind the way that ASCII works. But the problem with that is you couldn't encode any script in a standard way with ASCII. It was all, it was just 128 or 256 characters. So Unicode was developed in the 90s and 2000s, and that created a character set that allowed 1.1 million tokens or characters. At the moment, there's about 154,000 characters defined by Unicode. There's also other standards that get into structured information, like comma-separated values, which allows you to store tables. Doc or docx, which is a proprietary format. Actually, I think docx is not proprietary. The fonts that determine how characters are displayed, and hypertext markup language, which is the encoding scheme of the World Wide Web. Of course, programming itself is a form of writing. It's somewhere between a text and a machine. Heim kind of observed that in the transition from when I was, I'm old, so when I first started university, most people were using typewriters rather than word processors. And Heim was writing at about that time and kind of observed that the dynamics of working with text and how you think are different. So writing becomes a process, a kind of, I mean, it was always a process, but it becomes a process of manipulating text at random. And that supports experimentation, revisions, multiple versions of texts, and so on. And it also produces a kind of phenomenon that you don't know what the final official version is, maybe until you print it out and circulate it. Another feature of hypertext is the nonlinearity of text. So normally you read a book by starting at the, in English, starting at the top left of the first page and working your way left to right, and then to the next line and so on. Of course, there were already nonlinear texts like encyclopedia and dictionaries and so on, which weren't linear, but hypertext allowed you to jump, allowed the author to create jumping points from one part of a text to another part of the text. So here we start seeing a kind of complication of text. The World Wide Web, developed in 1989, changed the way that textual communication kind of came apart by introducing a very simple addressing scheme in the codes of HTML and HTTP. I won't go too much detail of that. Okay, so let's move on to the third section of this lecture, understanding signs, semiotics, and large language models. This is what I posted on Facebook. So mostly, of course, they're known as large language models. I'm using the term that Ferdinand Saussure used instead to talk about langue. I'm not very good at pronouncing French. Yep. It's a French word, a special word for language. And he makes an important distinction between langue and parole. So structuralism is an intellectual movement that emerged in the early 20th century. And it analyzed, so the kind of common sense idea of language is that when I say the word chair, that relates to that chair over there. Maybe it kind of relates to the essence of a chair. So you can look at all sorts of different chairs, and yet you attribute to them the word chair. You might have other language like armchair or lecture theatre chair. Whether you call a couch a chair is not kind of clear. So, according to structuralist conceptions of language, language is a system of related elements. So, for example, an armchair and a rocking chair are distinguished from one another in language based on that kind of operational difference between an armchair, which is stable, and a rocking chair, which you can move backwards and forwards by moving your body on the chair. And so the distinction, and I guess that's where a whole lot of technologies that we have come with a set of terms that are associated with it. So ASCII, for example, is an encoding scheme, and we need to have that distinction between ASCII and Unicode as ways of communicating differences. And so structuralism focuses on the underlying structures rather than the surface phenomena. So me saying chair is kind of a surface phenomenon, but when I say chair, or when I write the word chair or the word cat, then you have a conception of a cat, which I'll come to briefly. And this revolutionized approaches to linguistics. So language isn't a collection of names for objects. Meaning emerges from the differences between elements, so the difference between an armchair and a rocking chair. In language, there are only differences without positive terms. Now that's a kind of weird way of thinking it, isn't it? That particularly, when you were learning language for the first time, you had the word chair and even a picture of a chair and the chair itself. And a lot of artists kind of play with that paradox about what is the relationship between different types of sign and different types of phenomena in the world. So the value of any element depends on its position within the system. So I'll give you some examples. This is kind of an iconic representation of a cat. But if we want to understand that or communicate that through the English language, we use the word CAT. And that's kind of, or the sound k-at, which doesn't have any real relation to a real cat, but it's just that we kind of all agree that the word cat makes a distinction between all other types of animal and the cats. So we have the sound image or the text image. So the sound cat or the image of the letters cat, C-A-T. And then we have a mental image of that. Now this is a sort of, this is a kind of confusing phenomenon, but the sign is both, the sign always comes with both the mental image and the sound image or the image. But the relationship between the two is arbitrary. And you kind of know that because the word cat in different languages refers to the same kind of mental image, but has a different sound image. So signs are meaningful in relation to other signs. So the word cat is distinguished, essentially means the cat is not a dog. And you might make distinctions like Siamese is not like a Bengal cat. So language tends to operate with systems of binary oppositions and differences. So you have the distinction between day and night. So they kind of belong together, day and night, but they're inherently opposed. Of course, there's those sort of interesting phenomena at the boundaries. So dusk and dawn, does night begin at the moment that the sun drops below the horizon? But of course, there's still a little bit of residual light when you're making that transition between day and night. So the distinction is not always entirely clear. There's often ways in which those distinctions can be negotiated. And similarly, hot and cold, those are kind of relative terms, but I guess they do, generally they relate to the body. So yesterday, was it really hot yesterday? Yeah, yesterday it was hot, today it's cold. And so there's a distinction we can make. We have life and death, we have happy and sad, but some of these oppositions privilege one term over another. So one term is kind of defined as normal or unmarked, which means that you don't need to make the point that, so you start with a male and then you oppose that to a female, and in the way that language operates, there's a kind of a hierarchy in that distinction in patriarchal culture. And similarly with the employer and the employee, or the idea of the inside and the outside. So something that's inside is close to you and comfortable. Something on the outside is somehow kind of threatening and mysterious. And so the inside is the privileged term. In kind of political discourse, there's the idea that capitalism in the West is the natural order, which is opposed to communism. Derrida makes a really interesting point, which he said that in Western culture, speech is a privileged phenomenon. Now, the reason why he says that is that the presence of the speaker is essential to verifying the truth of speech. So when you have the author absent from the speaking position, then then you lose something about that sense of presence. And Derrida kind of deconstructs that distinction, and he points out many ways in which writing is kind of primary. Foucault talks about the distinction between reason and madness. So those categories about defining people as mad or reasonable is a kind of partly it's a diagnostic phenomenon. So, if someone's mad, you can see various things about them. But it also becomes a way in which discourse or language helps to make a distinction that allows you to discipline or allows you to act on the mad, put them into an asylum. So by that kind of diagnosis, that's not just a simple objective observation about someone's mental state. It's a way of dividing a population, saying here are the mad people, here are the reasonable people. So all of these differences are related to each other structurally, or in the Derrida and Foucault, they're often known as post-structuralist, which is to say that the structures that Saussure identified are in fact loaded. You can sort of think about it, loaded in terms of a gun, that they actually kind of can exercise power, and certain types of distinctions structure the way that you can think and the way that you can communicate and talk about things. Another really important distinction is that of langue and parole. So parole you can actually see. You can see, what I'm speaking now is parole. But in order to perform parole, I need to be able to access this more abstract, this more absent phenomenon called langue. And langue is interesting because it kind of exists in individuals. So some people have language competency. And it also exists in communities. So, and so it circulates and is contested and changes over time. So you have new words emerging, and with those new words, there's new distinctions, there's new binaries and oppositions and differences. But langue is a kind of set of system of relations that I've just been talking about, whereas parole is something that is concrete. The structuralists were mainly interested in langue, but it exists as a social contract among speakers. So that means we all kind of agree, more or less, to use a language in a particular way. So there's a few different traditions that have kind of got beyond the structuralist conception of language. And one of those is speech act theory, which says that language isn't just about differences between words. It's actually a way of doing things. So if you make a promise, it's not just that you're making that a promise has to be kept and so on, and all of those linguistic dimensions. It's also a social commitment that the speaker is making. If you promise such and such, that changes the situation sort of in a way that's outside or beyond language, but it's performed through language. Judith Butler also talks about the way that gender is performed. So the ways in which the distinctions in language between the way that language helps to perform the distinctions of gender relations. Post-structuralism I've already talked about, the Derrida and Foucault. And there's also a linguist who was actually from the University of Sydney, although he spent quite a lot of time at Peking University. And he talked about systemic functional linguistics, which argues that language is a system, but it's also something that has functions, like interpersonal functions and textual metafunctions and so on. I don't have time to go into that. So, using language. Now this is a kind of abstract concept of the two dimensions of the way that language works. It works kind of on a horizontal axis of sequencing words kind of over time or across space. And the paradigmatic, which is the vertical relations between elements that could substitute for each other. So in other words, you can structure a sentence and then you can choose words, and you might be able to substitute one word for another and slightly change it change the meaning, but both of these relations structure our use, and they form a linguistic grid. So, the cat sat on the mat. So the syntagmatic dimension is the order of the words. The cat sat on the mat. Now, we could possibly change the syntagmatic dimension of the words by saying the mat sat on the cat, but that would be a bit weird. It would be kind of, we wouldn't, probably wouldn't use that term. But there's many ways that you can talk about cats, make statements about cats that might be put in a different syntagmatic form. So this is about combination and continuity. And this is the kind of concrete, this is actually what you see when you're reading. The paradigmatic axis, on the other hand, is about selection, substitution, and similarity. So the term cat might be substituted for the word feline, by the word feline. It is a synonym for cat. And so swapping it disappears one term and appears the other term and slightly shifts the meaning. So feline is a kind of more formal term. You might say moggy, or you might say... it would also make sense to say the man sat on the mat. This is expanding the paradigm beyond domestic pets and into people who are doing yoga. So the man sat on the mat. Now, if we put the word house sat on the mat, now this wouldn't make sense because it doesn't belong to the paradigm. One thing you might kind of look at is, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but the cat sat on the. Now, if you analyze language statistically, you might say that that particular idiom will tend to end up with the word mat. It rhymes. It's sort of often an example of language. It might be something that you learn as a child. So it's predictable to a certain extent that that sequence will be in that will end with the word mat. So I thought I'd try this and ask ChatGPT, where did the cat sit? And the LLM predicted which was the most likely word. So the question, where did the cat sit, invites a kind of a repetition or a response that says the cat sat on the, and yes, it did say mat. And then it put in a little cute Unicode character of the cat. But I tried that with a few different large language models, and what's interesting is it doesn't necessarily produce the most predictable outcome every time. You're trying to get me to say the cat sat on the mat again, aren't you? It then kind of asks you, in a way it's sort of a performative language, is there something else you'd like to ask about the cat? So it's turning it back on me. So it's kind of not just predicting the word, it's actually kind of doing something. Remember I talked about speech acts? So it's kind of making a demand on me to, and now the interesting thing about that is all of these responses were not programmed into a large language model. It wasn't it wasn't encoded by the programmer. It came from the model. And you can see that I asked, what is a cat? And it answered one way, and then it answered another way. Because there's a whole lot of possible answers to the word, what is a cat? And it tries various kind of efforts that are kind of partly random, but kind of often correct. But, so how is it that a system is able to make predictions about the next word? Well, it's through a training process. So we input the word cat and we tokenize it, which means if you have longer words, you might break the word up into fragments or tokens. You then vectorize it. So this is only a few of the vectors, but the way that vectors work is that you're essentially mapping a multidimensional space for relationships between meanings that emerge from within the training process. So these vectors are put into the input layer. You've heard of the idea of deep learning AI. Well, that's deep because you have many hidden layers where the token gets sent through the input layer, and then all of those vectors are kind of constituted to an output layer. And so you end up with this large language model. But what I'm kind of interested in is the way that it's a large Langue model. It's a large kind of model of structuralist meanings. So how do these distinctions get made? Well, on particular embeddings, there's the word cat, and that's related, it's close to, in latent space, it's close to the word kitten. And in fact, it's also related to dog and puppy. So cat is to kitten what dog is to puppy. And so large language models are able to make this distinction and make these distinctions, make these kind of connections in language. Similarly, the term ethical and unethical, you can see here we have those oppositions that I was talking about before, the reasonable and unreasonable. And so these are mapped, these are categories that are mapped, but we kind of don't realize that these categories have a politics. And so it will reproduce those politics. Oh yeah, that's right, that's quite important. The differences are based on statistical weights and not on the social contract between speakers. So whereas the way we use language is social and is mental, large language models operate through statistical weights, through the probability of one word versus another word or set of words. Just very briefly, an interesting thing is in 2017, there was an introduction of the transformer model. The earlier recurrent neural networks could start predicting words quite well, but as you got further from the prompt, they tended to sort of just go off into nonsense. The attention mechanism, which was introduced by some Google engineers, meant that you would systematically look at what was most important at the moment in generating a text. And so the attention mechanism is really important in that way. Now you can see that in this example of parsing a sentence, there's some ambiguity about John's notes, not so much a problem, but wants can be a noun or a verb. So I have wants, but John wants. So we have to disambiguate that somehow. And that's where the transformer model, from the context, because it's taking into account all of the context, recognizes that that's a verb. And similarly, the bank, that could be the bank of a river, but probably because you have this cash, which is not a noun, it's not I give you cash, it's to cash. And so the transformer model is able to disambiguate that, and this really solved a lot of problems with working with language with AI. So AI is trained on parole, but it maps Langue into statistical models. It works with differences, semantics, syntactics, pragmatics. It works with genre, but a lot of these things are not programmed in. They emerge from the patterns of differences that the large language model maps. So some hypotheses about LLMs. Users' prompts invoke differences modeled in latent space. So when I write a prompt, I am calling to the whole of language and asking it to discover the most likely outputs based on the whole system of differences. Things like language as action, grammar, genre, speech acts are not programmed. Now that's where a lot of the language translation people thought that language was logical, and that if you put in the rules, that you would then be able to translate from one language into another. Turns out that doesn't work very well. Language is not logical in that sense. Freaks people out to say that. But AI bias is intrinsic to LLMs. Even if you attempt to overcome this by curating the data, filtering it, debiasing, pre-processing, all of those things are after the fact attempts at overcoming the kind of differences that are implicit in the large Langue models. Errors are intrinsic to LLMs because it will give you the least improbable response. And if the training set doesn't, you've got a question? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so what's the point? No, I think the point is that what large language do is to find a process that parallels the way that human language works. Why? Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. Why would you develop it? And this kind of gets to my last point, which is LLMs are unsettling because we tend to assume that humans are the only entities capable of using language in any sophisticated way. And here we have a technology that seems to perform in a way that parallels the way that we work with language. And so that sort of comes up with the idea of the agent or the non-human actor. It's often called post-humanism. So the humanist age is over, and we have to find our way through a society in which we're not the only language users, and the implications of that for disciplines and institutions. Okay, thank you very much. worried I wouldn't be able to get through it.
Awesome.
Thanks, Sam. Did you
Where's the sign out? Oh, here.
sign out? Yeah.
Yeah.
And okay.
Good.
Thanks, Chris. This was really nice. Are you going back to the building or?
Or grab lunch and then have a tutorial.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have a question? I'll grab lunch and then have a tutorial.
Yeah.
See you. See you back now.
Because everything is biased, unfortunately.
So I use the language models to generate prompt and I put it into the journey. I want to the first picture. Yeah. And I use the it's generated by me sometimes. Like the first picture and it's like this. It's not true because there will not be the first. There was no. It shouldn't be a man. And so I give a prompt. Put prompt.
Would I be allowed to do a lecture announcement at Alice?
Last class is happening already.
Sorry?
No one did it already last week.
Oh yeah, but there's more things happening this week.
Like, you have like 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
2 minutes. Because the recording starts. So I don't want this to be
have
recorded.
Yeah, I'll do it 2 minutes. Okay. Hey everyone, my name's Jacob. I'm from Students Together Board. We take 2 minutes of your time to talk about the culture movement on campus. So some of you might have seen, universities recently unrolled a whole new slate of repressive anti-critics policies. They're trying to ban banner drops, they're trying to ban announcements like this in classes, and they're also